Anyone who says tourism is unequivocally great for the local community clearly hasn't lived around a popular tourist attraction. Sure, tourists bring in money and hopefully leave with a better understanding of the place they've visited, but the negative impact of too many visitors can be severe, especially on underserved and underprivileged groups like Indigenous communities. So how can tourism benefit rather than exploit them? And what should tourists be taking away from these visits beside vacation photos? I'm Tomasz Koper, and this is Connected on Taiwan Plus. Guiding us through this complex topic, we welcome Wagi Payan, an assistant professor at the Department of Ethnic Relations and Cultures, College of Indigenous Studies at Dong Hwa University, speaking to us from Taipei. And in Taichung, we have Cheryl Robbins, a freelance tour guide based in Taiwan. Wagi, I want to start with you here. As I've said in the introduction there, tourism can be a mixed bag of experiences and benefits. But all things considered, do you feel that Indigenous tourism is a net positive or a net negative for the communities?
Oh, this is a very, very tough question because I don't really have an absolute answer. I think it depends on who controls the narrative and who defines success. So for me, I would feel the key question would be, who decides what successful tourism look like and who holds the authority to interpret culture? So there is actually one concept I would like to mention. It's the tourist gaze. That's something we need to be aware of. So when Indigenous communities change themselves to fit external expectations, and tourism becomes negative. But when communities are able to maintain everyday life and tell their own stories on their own terms, and in this way, I feel tourism can be an expression of cultural agency. And based on my field works before, and it actually shows that economic benefits are often overestimated, while cultural and social impacts are underestimated. So the real question for me is not whether to develop tourism or seeing its positive or negative. The real question probably would be like, what kind of tourism we choose to develop that will actually affect my answer.
And I want to dig into all of these aspects, all of these things that you mentioned later in the show. But first, Cheryl, you cater to foreign visitors who want to visit Indigenous communities here in Taiwan. What kind of experiences are they usually after? Is it more entertainment or more understanding?
I believe it's more understanding. I think most international visitors are interested in an authentic experience. They don't want something where they're singing and dancing or these kind of performances when it's not time for these kinds of performances. For example, sometimes they're singing and dancing when there are ceremonies happening throughout the year, and then that's fine. That's not for tourism. That's part of the culture. And I think what people want most is interaction with the local people. They want to know how they live their lives now, and they also want a better understanding of traditional life, how they lived their lives in the past.
Speaking of the past and the present, Wagi, what are the attitudes of domestic tourists visiting Indigenous communities, and have those changed over the years?
Yeah, I think it used to be the majority of Taiwanese visitors, they approach Indigenous communities with a sense of curiosity towards what they perceived as disappearing cultures. And they expect to see something traditional, primitive, or frozen in time. rather than understanding Indigenous culture through the lenses of either cultural revitalization or decolonization, this kind of aspects. However, this mindset is less common than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But I have to say, sadly, it still exists. And all these expectations are socially constructed over time and rooted in the stereotypes.
Well, Cheryl, much like every other industry in Taiwan, the tourism industry is regulated. And I'm curious to know how these regulations are constraining perhaps sometimes, and maybe sometimes allowing and enabling tour operators and tour guides here in Taiwan. What has been your experience?
Well, for example, as a tour guide, I'm not really able to legally sell my itineraries to my clients. And Indigenous communities and even fishing communities and farming communities are kind of in the same boat. So it means that their communities don't have full control of their tourism. So tourism is really controlled by the travel agencies. And most of the travel agencies in Taiwan are not owned by Indigenous people. And so there's often sometimes a lack of understanding by the travel agents. And then that trickles down to the tour guides, and that trickles down to the clients as well.
Well, Wagi, are Indigenous operators running into these obstacles as well? And how are communities trying to regain control over the tourism industry that is happening in their communities, in their villages?
I also agree with Cheryl. There are lots of external operators, and they often capture most of the profits, and the communities they absorb the environmental and social impacts. And the other thing is, for people who work in tourism within Indigenous communities, one of the major challenges is whether there is an internal consensus and fair resources distribution. So, for example, if there is a single private tour guide brings large tour groups into even it's their own communities, but the daily lives of the villagers is it's definitely will be disrupted. And if all profit go to that individual, tensions arise. And for local Indigenous guides, I feel one of the deeper challenges is that how do you balance the market demand with cultural integrity? So when what tourists want to see differs from what you want to convey, and do you compromise, or are you a service provider responding to demand, or a cultural subject with agency? So I feel this is the other than the challenges that Cheryl mentioned. These are the aspects I would like to add.
Well, Wagi, I want to bring in another aspect of this situation, which is the involvement of local governments and local authorities. I know that they do distribute resources between Indigenous communities, but perhaps not everyone is happy with the way it's done. Can you tell us what that looks like and what the controversies are around this?
Yeah, so some government subsidy programs, they evaluate communities based on, for example, how many visitors they can accommodate, or recent visitor numbers and the revenue they've been generate. But there is a dangerous thing. So they kind of assume that a larger number really means better development or better lives for the villagers. And this quantitative indicators, for me, is quite dangerous. So when public resources are distributed based on visitor numbers, the assumption is more tourists equals more success. And this ignores, for example, over tourism, long-term cultural impacts, or the inequalities in benefit distribution. And for a long time, policy thinking has followed this top-down developmental logic. And true support, for me, it should mean allowing communities to decide whether to develop tourism and also what kind of tourism to pursue.
Cheryl, do you think that communication is a problem for visitors who go to Indigenous communities? And I mean language, but also other obstacles, and also not necessarily only foreign visitors, but are there differences between domestic and foreign groups who go to places like that?
Well, as to the last part of the question, yes, often domestic tourists go in large groups, like large tour bus kind of size groups, and maybe even more than one tour bus. So this creates a situation in which it's very difficult to have those close interactions or even any kind of long-term interaction. Because of so many people coming at one time, there's usually not enough room for them to stay in a community. So maybe they can only stay for half a day or maybe at the most one day. So most of my groups are maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people. So in that way, we can actually stay in the communities and we can have a more in-depth introduction to the community. And there's a lot more chances for interactions and for understanding of both people's, both sides, their cultural backgrounds. Because if we talk about things like socially responsible tourism, one of the things is that both the host and the tourists should benefit, and there should be a mutual respect and understanding between them.
Well, Wagi, you already mentioned the tourist gaze, but I know that your research also focused on moodscapes and creating atmospheres. Are those moods and atmospheres that communities create, what role do they serve? Are they more in response to this tourist gaze and in response to their expectations? Or are they fulfilling goals that are set out by the community itself?
So the concept of tourist gaze, it emphasizes that tourists kind of like to visit different places to collect a lot of icons. So we want to come here, take a picture, and then everything has a special meaning that constructed through time. That concept helps us to understand how tourism expectations are formed. But when I focus on the moodscape and atmosphere, the moodscape, it actually challenges the assumption that communities must passively adapt to tourist expectations. And the atmosphere making is a form of cultural agency. So communities can actively shape the space, the emotion, the pace of the tour or the rhythm, and inviting visitors into their cultural temple. I'll put it this way.